Hello, welcome to the Living Process. My name is Greg Madison, and in this episode, I'm speaking again with Donata Schoeller. And if you saw our first conversation, you will know that we decided, rather than trying to pack everything into one conversation, that we would instead try to take sort of separate topics and address each one individually. So this is our second attempt, and this time we're talking about philosophy and psychotherapy and the role of thinking in each, and how the culture of philosophy, for example, and perhaps also the culture of psychotherapy, is such that there's a restriction on the kinds of thinking that are usually acceptable, and how Donata, in her role as director of the program on embodied critical thinking, is working with her colleagues to try to expand the kinds of thinking that are permissible in philosophy. And of course, for us, that means a more experiential thinking and being able to go into the body and the kind of conditions that are required so that a person can do that. So there's some kind of a break from the typical analytical and critical thinking in philosophy, and instead something more like a focusing session where the thinker has the space to get deeper into their thinking and is welcomed and received so that more and more can come. And that this may include more emotion and more experiencing and more biographical instances of what the person is thinking about. Although we're talking a lot about philosophy, I felt that the conversation is very generally applicable, and it probably would have interest for a wide variety of people, even those who are afraid of philosophy in some particular way. Donata, if you don't know, is an international scholar and is on faculty at different universities, and has written widely and even translated some of Gendlin's original main texts. There's more information on Donata as well as a website so that you can contact her or get more into her work and also the courses that she offers as a focusing trainer. So welcome back to the Living Process and my conversation with Donata Schoeller. So I'm very happy to welcome back Donata. And I know that you're recovering from one of these bugs that are going around everywhere. So we'll kind of take it slow today. And I wanted you just to invite you to decide where we will begin.
Yes, maybe I think it would be nice to explore something that I'm continuously exploring myself in my head. Sometimes I'm very satisfied with how I can develop this topic, and sometimes I'm very unsatisfied. It's all still very fresh.
Good.
And maybe the handle could really be this, what we consider, this research group that has its anchor at the University of Iceland, what we consider as embodied critical thinking,
Okay.
which is so inspired by Gendlin,
Mhm.
one of the major inspirations of this. And we more and more realize what kind of challenges are involved in what we mean by embodied critical thinking. And maybe I can start us off with a quote from Gendlin, that kind of gets into this, into the challenge. And this quote, you might know it. It's from an unpublished manuscript, and he says, we think more than we can say, and we feel more than we can think, and we live more than we can feel, and there's so much more. Yes, and so embodied critical thinking really is maybe one way to name the specificity of this approach, that we include our own experiencing more into thinking about anything, so that we don't. So of course, there's always so much we know about a problem. There's so much texts, positions, histories we know. There's discourses we know, and we kind of learn when we study, in school or in philosophy. We engage with texts. We learn positions. We learn, the ongoing discussions about positions and so on. But we don't really know how to integrate and involve our own experiencing that comes along with thinking about something.
Yes. So can I just respond a little bit, because I've noticed something happening in me just as you've been talking, that you first introduced this term embodied critical thinking. And the first time you introduced it, it felt exciting. And then you offered that quote from Jean. And then when you used the term after that, embodied critical thinking, I thought, oh, it's so small compared to the quote that seems to be encouraging not only putting aside everything that's come before temporarily, but entering into what we can think through the body, the experiencing of the body, and how what we're feeling as we're thinking and saying and finishing a sentence, how the feeling that goes along with that actually can inform us and help us refine what we say things in a new, fresh way. But that experiencing is also not the whole story. There's more. Is there a way of inviting more than we can experience into what we think?
Well, I think I think one kind of still needs to address some questions that come before.
Yes.
Because we don't, usually we don't even know how to involve or to engage with this experiencing, And now, like, to make it very simple, we think about a problem, and we kind of feel that there's an importance to this problem, or we also feel that this problem or this question is very relevant.
Yeah.
And then mostly, this is a kind of driving motor that gets us going, and then we might read a lot of things, and we might say, oh, this position, I really like it, and that I don't, or that seems very illogical, or we collect material, but we don't really know how to look at this, let's say, at this ground, which, our own ground, our own kind of interest, the experience that kind of lives in this interest, the experience, the whole mesh of experiences that live in what we conceive as relevant. For us, it's totally clear, this is very important, but just starting to spell out some of it is difficult, and it needs a kind of skill we don't usually learn, let's say in schools or universities, and more and more, this whole embodied approach agrees it needs skill to turn towards our first person experience.
Mm-hmm.
And one agrees there's a whole complexity involved,
Mm-hmm.
and that it needs methods. And
Yes.
like focusing and thinking at the edge are really so revolutionary, because they are methods that work so well to enter into this experiencing ground that is so full, that is so rich, that is so messy, and from which our thinking grows.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, the only thing that is, that we can show about it are some kind of positions or opinions.
Yeah.
But very much is kind of underneath, like roots, roots. Yes.
Can I just ask, because as I listen to you, it reminds me of something that happens in therapy, and I'm curious to know if it is in fact similar to what you're pointing to. When a client comes to me and starts telling me a story about something that happens, often they speak in the general. This is what always happens, it's this, is that. There's a lot of thinking, a lot of storytelling, and it's usually quite general, almost abstract in a way. And my response is always to say to them, can you give me an instance of when it happened? And I'm wondering if that is at all useful in what you're describing, if we're philosophically wanting to understand the concept of power, if we use that as an example, I would have to ask you, well, can you give me an instance where that was alive, or where that was happening for you, sometime where power was relevant? And then you at least have more than the thinking, you have some sort of embodied memory of when it was actually a part of living.
A very good example. Thank you for this good example, because this is a good example that shows that like if you would have this topic in philosophy, you would usually engage in theories of power, and your own experience would function rather indirectly in this. And doing this move of bringing in your own instances is exactly what we are doing in embodied critical thinking. Yes.
Yeah.
And we are also kind of inviting people to even explore the felt dimension of this topic as they sense it. And what I think makes this so challenging, and this is also, where I always, this is what I mentioned at the beginning, turning around something in embodied critical thinking, is that this move is still considered as a very private move, or a very subjective move. And here we touch, what also, one of our younger researchers, she calls it, Monika Lindner, she calls it, where this kind of approach and this kind of practices, they're like tectonic plates. It's like you meet a cultural tectonic plate. You're up against something big. So this is normally considered a private move, a subjective move. And of course, if you turn to instances, you might really encounter something really difficult. That if you do that in this middle of, you want to think about something in a philosophical context, but if you do that, you might touch something very difficult. It could be, I think the term trauma is now used very inflationary, but there could be an aspect that could be traumatic. There could be a lot of vulnerability. Tears could come.
Yes.
And then we touch something that one says, well, this is not philosophy anymore, and this is therapy. Okay. And so this, I think, is so interesting, how kind of the move we make, or this approach, these kind of clear boundaries, we cannot keep up in that way. And I think this has great implications. It has great implications. And I would love to be able to spell out some more of the implications that I sense. And maybe I can just point them, and then we can go slowly. Yeah. if we understand thinking more from, in this inclusive way, we acknowledge that, it always grows from this experiential embodied ground in which social and cultural and private histories and hurts and opportunities and trainings, everything is meshed. Gender is so beautifully, there's a pre-separated multiplicity in thinking, in experiencing. There's a pre-separated multiplicity in experiencing. If we acknowledge that thinking grows from this ground, then it would imply that thinking, is not just this logical deduction, development of thought, spelling out implications of concepts, synthesizing, analyzing. But then one would need to acknowledge that maybe the human capability of thinking would need other skills. It would need kind of skills to know how to touch this felt dimension in a way that it is not separated off and belongs just to therapy, but that it can unfold in a way that we can think with it, that it can clarify, and that of course means a totally different thinking movement, and it has great implications for so many things. I also think, and here I might be a bit quick, it has implications of public discourse. It has implications for philosophical discourse, and there's something that I sense extremely relevant in this, and I go a bit quick too now, but I do want to say it, we can come back, that also very often public discourse is so heated up that we're just so stuck. And I do think this has to do with this having a too narrow picture of what discourse is and what one should be able, of the skills that are needed to really, have a discourse that integrates more of an issue and how it is lived, how it is held by human people, by humans, in societal and real contexts. So I said a lot now.
Yeah.
And there's so much I would like to spell out.
Yeah. Let me say something back and then see where the jumping off point is to go a little bit deeper. What it really reminds me of is when I have been presenting either to activists or presenting the embodied possibilities of kind of decision making and that sort of thing, and organizing in groups. If a group needs to make a decision and I'm saying to them, well, let's go into the body and see how you're holding this, there's 5 people in the group maybe, and each person is doing that. What I need to say beforehand is, whatever's going on for you in your life, let's get a little bit of distance from that first, because I'm wanting to make the distinction that I think you're also wanting to make, that going into the body isn't just going into a therapeutic mode, that there's a way of going into the body and accessing the experiencing level and using it sort of in terms of decision making, in terms of political thinking, in terms of philosophy, and how to keep it in that realm appropriately so that we become more clear how experiencing and thinking go together.
Yeah. Yeah. So you say the skill is how to do it appropriately so that experiencing and thinking go together.
Yes. Rather than experiencing and just personal therapy.
Yes. Yes. I think what I would like to experiment with, is this notion that if you are a thinker, and we are all thinkers, and if you are like that knowing how to enter this experiential space,
yeah,
that maybe knowing how to think might also need to imply a little bit basic knowing how to heal. And you know, this intuition, that philosophy, and let's take it in a very wide sense, because I think everybody is a philosopher. Everybody has these major questions. And this intuition that philosophy is also therapy, that, you know, goes through the history of philosophy. And Wittgenstein has this wonderful image that, you know, philosophy helps the fly that is caught in a fly bottle the way out. And the fly bottle he conceived as wrong ways of thinking. Yeah. But if we take this embodiedly, you know, wrong ways of thinking are not something that are separate from us and just in a logical space, but we embody the thinking. Yes. We embody the thinking, and we embody a thinking that hurts. We embody, a thinking that evolves from so many situations that have so many different experiences. So that thinking also means always touching this embodied ground. And so this going in appropriately means, how do I touch it? You know, that how can I touch it in a healing way? And I think the interesting thing about methods such as focusing or thinking at the edge is that it shows really simple principles of you know, what a minimal healing skill you know, needs to, or what a minimal healing skill is made of. And one of these things is just this being non-judgmentally with whatever you experience right here and now. You know, just being able to dwell with it a little bit. You know, not wanting it away, not pushing, not jumping into it, you know, not putting a critical label it, but just this very, very simple and yet challenging skill to just be with whatever is. You know, it's like a little bit a different movement, and of course it's also kind of basic component of meditative skills, just being with what is. And that kind of is, in an analogy, it's like letting this what is just breathe a little bit.
Yeah.
And just being with gives it also space, because you don't cramp it and you don't transform, and you just, I think this is one of those minimal skills. And the second minimal skill is then to relate it to language in this responsive way, that you don't impose something on it. You know, you don't impose what you would like this to be, or what it should be, or what you don't even want to see. But that you use language in a different way, as to, again, in a kind of touching way, to really see what language works here. For this to become explicit. Yeah. And then the third thing, now these points are rather fresh, but the third thing is this very, very strange insight or finding, which also goes through so many, you know, therapeutic and other disciplines, that if you name it, a transformation is taking place. Like these are like three competences. It's like almost, it's like a finding that this is not a logical deduction how it should be. It's like a finding that if you can be with, and if you use this language in a responsive way, that you can name it in a way that it, you know, that there's this kind of a kind of deeper understanding of, this is what this experiencing is about.
Yeah.
That with the understanding, a kind of transformation happens.
Yeah.
And I think this is what I want to mean by healing kind of thinking, that a kind of understanding that is also, in a way, transformative.
Yes. So let me say some of that back to you. because there's something that feels like a problem to me that I want to ask you if it seems like a problem to you. The first thing that you're saying seems very important to me, and I think, hadn't said it up until now. We've been talking about how experiencing informs thinking, but it's also true that thinking can restrict and have an impact on experiencing. If we have a particular theory and we are intent on adhering to that theory and it doesn't actually resonate with experiencing, it's a problem. You can feel that physically, the constriction of trying to hold a belief that your body is going, it's more than that, or it's different than that.
You can mute the experiencing by thinking.
Yes, exactly. You can mute experiencing by thinking.
And that's just brackets. This is also as now scaled up. This is something, this is the main critique of Hannah Arendt towards ideologies, that she says, in an ideology, experiencing has nothing to say, because everything is already set and determined how reality should be, and one is not interested in experiencing, has nothing to say. And I have the feeling that in a very small scale, this is what we can personally do.
Yes, definitely.
Constantly.
Definitely. We can hold an ideology that gives us an answer before we've even asked the question. And I would say this, I don't want to lose your other points, but I would say, as an aside, I think the antidote to ideology is process, because process cannot become ideology. A process practice maybe can become ideology, but process itself, I don't think can. But I want to get back to your other couple of points. One is noticing. I think that you're pointing to the importance of Gendlin's step of resonating, noticing when you have the right word that it actually does something. And it can actually further your thinking if you find yourself on the right track because you finally have found the right word or the right phrase or something. Noticing that is a skill and really important. It's like where the body talks back to you and helps you with your thinking. So I think that's very important. Noticing how thinking can mute the body, but if we develop the skill of listening to the body, how the body can really inform the terms we use, the words we use. The thing that I was concerned might be a problem I want to check with you is when you use the word healing. I agree with you. My concern, and I think now this example of power might be a really good one, because if I ask somebody in a philosophy class, think of a time where you felt something like power in your life. They might go to a time when their father was imposing some strict discipline on them or something. That is an example of power, but it is also something that is so personally evocative that if they were to stay with it, it could become a very healing event, definitely. But that's therapy. The question of power as a philosophical concept is gone. You might be able to return to it after the healing has happened and say, okay, what does that tell you about power? Can you still subtly feel it enough to let it inform you? But I guess I'm not thinking that in most philosophy classes, you're wanting fellow thinkers and students to first go through a therapeutic process and then go back to the philosophy.
Yes, thank you. Thank you that you say it in that way. But I think I do imply a little bit of such a revolutionary movement.
Okay.
But I think of course, it will be a totally different kind of process, but still it is something entirely different of how we conceive thinking now, let's say in an academic philosophical context, which also might be a very narrow state of how one understood thinking in relation to a long history. But in thinking at the edge, this is exactly what Gendlin invites us to do.
Mm.
We don't go back to our whole history. So maybe, maybe if we could say, okay, let's keep therapy as a category, and then we really look at our whole history, and it's more about our own history and maybe a blockage that we have in our whole living, whereas doing these little movements or the skill of little movements as being able to, work with texts, think analytically, think, coherently, but also do this other movement and say, okay, but these instances, they work in my thinking anyhow. They work in what I like and what I don't like. They work in what triggers me and what doesn't. They work in my harsh criticism, which can be very unfair, and very hurtful. So being able to look at small probes of instances, and then, of course, it needs conditions. And these conditions are part of the skill set that we learn in embodied critical thinking. And I termed this phrase reflexive care, that for this movement, it needs a different kind of setting. It needs a setting where you just listen to the other person, and where you turn from this critical sharpness into a kind of accepting and very solidary and very open space where it's just about noticing the whole thing. And maybe finding these words in this responsive process, words that work, which is a very pragmatic idea. They don't only work in situations outside of us, we're always part of it. So words that work for our living, situated organism that generates understanding. And of course, it might mean to include more feelings and emotions. It might mean to include that you're also allowed to, to cry, because I think crying is an embodied process of understanding. And after the crying, and I experience it with my colleagues, and if we give each other the thinking goes on differently. And we cut all of this off. We cut this whole felt dimensions off as not thinking. It's such a major cut. We do something to our thinking, and we feel the heated upness and the binary patterns in our intellectual debates and in our public debates. And I have the feeling that's utterly connected with a truncated thinking that is not able, not able to care for this more. Care for this more in listening practices, in attentional practices. And now we see it everywhere. The problem is there. The problem is there, and it also has to do with many things, but I think it also has to do with a much too narrow understanding and skill set of what thinking is.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. So let me say it back to you, and what it evokes for me. The first thing that it makes me think of is often when I witness political stances, people taking a political stance on something, I glibly say it's not politics, it's psychology. And it's both. I think that's what you're saying and this is interesting because it gets to your point. One of the ways that we were talking about today was this question of what's really the difference between philosophy and psychotherapy. And I think you're making a plea that where the distinction has been drawn is too restrictive. It actually keeps us stuck in ways of thinking that are sedimented, you might say. And that there's a different place to draw that distinction that is a little bit more flexible and is further, it offers much more space to allow the thinker to let their thinking take them into a healing process and then back to their thinking. And that the response then is a much less rigid kind of thinking.
Yes. And at least, maybe maybe my word healing was a bit too big, but at least to take them back into an acknowledging process, to at least become aware of those grounds and give them some kind of minimal attention and minimal understanding that comes from there, and that is a different move than, let's say, habituated critical moves or debating moves. It's a totally different move. Exactly. And also, like you said, and maybe I can also, that we kind of introduced the disciplinary boundaries into our thinking practices. Mm-hmm. But if philosophy is, considered the discipline that traditionally doesn't have, it asks questions that, single disciplines may not ask. We can always question everything. Philosophy understands itself as, not obtaining to, the questions do not obtain to disciplinary boundaries. So we do acknowledge that this is a very wide field of thinking that we open up. But if this is really so, then we should maybe also question the boundary. Well, this is thinking and this is therapy. Mm-hmm. Maybe, because where is that boundary in our thinking really? Why do we say, okay, this is something difficult, this hurts, it doesn't belong to thinking? And that, I think, is this really beautiful thing about him, or makes me so excited, but maybe this is just, personal. Mm-hmm. And I think this is this wonderful kind of challenge and provocation of embodied critical thinking, that we kind of we really face, this a more holistic understanding of thinking, which then also implies different skills.
Yes.
But so these have great cultural and academic implications.
So I feel like I'm really getting it now. And I think I was a little bit deaf to what you were saying initially, because I come from psychotherapy and psychology, and I hadn't heard clearly enough what I think you're saying now. So let me say it back to you, because I think I've got it. You're rightly saying philosophy can be about anything. It crosses all of the usual disciplinary boundaries.
In its questions.
In its questions. The content of philosophy is wide open. But you're pointing out, but there is this strange boundary between what is thinking and what isn't thinking. That aspect, the process of philosophy, isn't totally open, but it could be much more open. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if we do open up the process of philosophy and our definition of thinking to include the whole felt dimension, and to notice how valuable that is in our thinking, then we also have to change the culture of philosophy to allow these attitudes of being very receptive, being patient, bringing the body in as a process that requires a different pace at times. It's not just this kind of analytical slicing things up. It requires a cultural shift to expand our thinking.
Yes, and I don't want to make all the rich methods that philosophy already has small. Yeah, but I just say it includes a different kind of skill set.
Yes.
And you named a few of this. It includes a different kind of skill set, how we are towards each other, but also how we are towards oneself.
Yes, exactly.
And that is so. And but that has quite provocative potential, towards the status quo.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm thinking that you anticipate and maybe have already received the kind of critique that comes back when you make this suggestion.
That's exactly one of the major things that that we need, that of course I needed to face when going in this direction. And it's a very fruitful major tension also of clarifying our own understanding of the implications of what embodied critical thinking is. Yeah. And maybe just, I think maybe we should then also slowly stop. I just want to still say something you said before, where you said, and what I also said, that, that thinking has the danger of, muting the experiencing, because the experiencing very often is not yet in words. It needs a whole process to make sense,
Yeah.
But we can, of course, and we must say it can also be the other way around, that if we are not skilled in dealing with this preconceptual felt language, then of course it can also be, that our experience and our feeling can completely put aside everything we think, which can be terrible. So that in some way, it's really about a balance, about a balance, to not have one side or the other be dominant.
Yes.
Yeah? It's like a very democratic, being able to, for a very democratic dialogue of these different, of these different meaningful parties we consist of, that have different languages and that have different, ways of making sense. You also need to kind of learn to spell out these different parties in different ways.
Yes.
Where Mary Hendricks' nice notion of the felt sense, the capacity of the felt sense literacy comes in.
Exactly. And I thought when you used the word a while ago of being triggered, that you were pointing out that, sometimes you can't even think in a particular direction because there's something in you that goes, no, there's something that's not been looked at there, and you're getting too close to it by even thinking about it.
Exactly. Or you're triggered and you just bash the other person.
Yes.
Or you cancel it out or so on, because you don't know how to do this homework, to look deeply into this triggering, to be able to hold it, to be able to have it breathe, and to make these little moves to say, aha, okay, there's still this, and there's still this, and there's still this. It's it's like adding, a new skill set into our available skill sets. And the problem about these new skill sets is that they kind of transgress a category that we thought, that it makes us think they don't belong there because they're subjective, they're therapeutic.
Yes, it's like we've made a profession to deal with all of that, and it's not philosophy.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I like that. I mean, the other thing I've been thinking as I've been listening to you is it works from the other side as well, from my side, where psychotherapy can be all about experiencing, and there are philosophical questions that arise in psychotherapy. And to be able to slow down and sort of really think them through, there can be all sorts of assumptions that are challenged if you go deeply into your experience of living in your biography. And they become philosophical questions, and there needs to be that back and forth from our side as well as from your side.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think all fascinating thinkers did these moves, and had these questions, these fundamental questions grow from the basis of their own life world and their own experiencing that made them question very accepted things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Should we leave it there with that?
Yeah, let's leave it there.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's leave it there.
I feel like we've outlined the problem. Now let's
right. That's right.
Leave it there. Right. Yeah.
Let's leave it there. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Yes. Yes, thank you also very much.